So good evening. I feel like they should be serving cocktails at this session. And I tell you, after the couple of days I've had, I get the first drink. But actually, we're not going to need any liquid stimulation. I suspect we'll get enough from our speakers. So I don't really need to introduce these two, but that's my job. Linda Darling-Hammond is Linda Darling-Hammond. She's the Charles Ducommun Professor of Education at Stanford University, a policy expert, one of my predecessors as president of AERA. Thankfully, in 24 hours, I will be a predecessor of AERA as president. She's also a member of the National Academy of Education. Her research, teaching, and policy work, as we all know, focus on school restructuring, teacher quality, and educational equity. She was the leader of President Obama's education policy team during his first term. She has 300 publications. The most recent one that I'm familiar with is The Flat World in Education: How America's Commitment to Equity Will Determine Our Future. She holds degrees from Yale and Temple. Steve Gunderson grew up in Wisconsin and attended the University of Wisconsin. He represented Wisconsin's 3rd Congressional District as a Republican. He served in Congress from 1980 until 1996. He was someone who was known as being able to work with individuals across the aisle when that sort of activity existed. He also has been president and CEO of the Council of Foundations. He's currently president of the Association of Private Sector Colleges and Universities, the association that supports what many of us know as for-profit institutions. He also has a new book on the topic. Now, what unites these two is that they care passionately about education. They also care passionately about equity. But their views are different. And again, not to be a broken record, but I'm trying to have conversations where we can disagree with one another. And these two are going to disagree with one another. Linda is more versed on K through 12 education, and Steve currently works in the post-secondary sector. Linda has what I think of as a clearly articulated view about the needs of public education. That's her emphasis. Steve has a clear view about how privatization can help America get where we want to go, need to go. That's his emphasis. My sense is that they have differing interpretations of the public good. So let me explain how things will go. I have asked Linda and Steve to speak each for about 10 minutes. This is not a debate, it's a conversation, especially at 6 o'clock at night or whatever time it is, 5 o'clock at night. Exactly. I've asked Linda and Steve to speak for 10 minutes, and then I have about 5 questions that I'd like them to respond to, and then we can open it up for questions and discussion and debate amongst ourselves. So, Linda, take it away.
Well, you guys are really the diehards here. You know, it should be happy hour. So, I think this is an interesting set of questions and one well worth our time and conversation. I'll start by saying that I really understand in many ways the potential strengths and challenges of all of our sectors of education and the value of services that are often provided privately in education, not only private schools but also curriculum materials, equipment, software, and so on. I and my children have experienced the benefits of both public and private schools, K-12 and higher ed in the U.S. I grew up, as did my husband, in good public schools in urban areas. Myself in Cleveland, my husband in Washington, D.C., where federal, state, and local investments in urban education were stronger than they are today. We both went to excellent private colleges. He went to Grinnell, Iowa, in order to get as far away as he could from Washington, D.C., and I went to Yale. We had college and government financial aid funds that allowed us to do that at no cost to our families. Our children went mostly to public schools and mostly got an excellent education, except for in the kindergarten, first grade years when we could not find developmentally appropriate teaching always in our local public schools. and for our youngest at the tail end of high school when we moved to California, and we discovered that public high schools here were large and highly tracked and were segregated by race within the tracks. And one of my daughter was actually an 11th grader at that point. She said, "Mom, I've been the only black child in the upper track. I can't do that again." And so we had to go to a private school to find an integrated setting for them to attend. So, we have challenges in all sectors that we need to be confronting, which is why I think this set of questions about privatization and public education are challenging. I've worked with other people to start several schools to accomplish specific goals. I worked with others to create a private preschool and daycare center, long before public preschool was even on the table. So if you wanted to do work in early childhood, it had to be private at that time. I've also helped found several small public high schools, both charter and non-charter. However, I do not believe that the extent of privatization of both K-12 and higher education that some are advocating as a policy goal in this country will ultimately be a productive approach to producing greater access or equity unless we reconceptualize how we approach that with appropriate regulations on access and support, nor do I necessarily think it will enable our nation to become more successful. In particular, I do believe that for-profit enterprises in education are highly problematic. I said that to Chris Whittle when he first began the Edison schools and asked me to consider chairing that board. There is, in my view, an unsolvable moral dilemma in deciding what kind of services you will not provide or what kind of high-need students you will not admit or keep in order for shareholders to make a profit. This problem was recognized in professional education over 100 years ago by Abraham Flexner and the Carnegie Corporation. The Flexner Report, which led to the modernization of medicine, was in part addressing problems in the rise of commercial medical care, medical schools that are eerily similar to the problems we hear about for-profit colleges today. The report sought our, quote, hearty sympathy for American youth who too often the prey of commercial advertising methods are steered into the practice of medicine with almost no opportunity to learn the difference between an efficient medical school and a hopelessly inadequate one. Such a boy falls an easy victim to the commercial medical school, whether operating under the name of a university or college or alone. The Flexner Report called insincere those schools' claims that they were serving the poor. The existence of many of these unnecessary and inadequate medical schools has been defended by the argument that a poor medical school is justified in the interest of a poor boy. It was all boys then, unfortunately. The facts set forth in this report make it evident that this argument is insincere, and the excuse which has hitherto been put forward in the name of the poor boy is really an argument on behalf of the poor medical school. So I think that there's a question about what for-profit entities sacrifice in the name of making a profit. Today, for-profit colleges have been controversial, especially the large publicly traded corporations. They have been great at public relations, great at outreach, and at making promises to students, but they tend to have left students with debt more than degrees and jobs. They do use taxpayer dollars. The major publicly traded or private equity firm colleges that were investigated by the U.S. Senate Help Committee, who serve 76% of all for-profit students. For those schools, 86% of revenues come from taxpayers, mostly in the form of student aid. 96% of for-profit students take out student loans, according to the most recent data from the U.S. Department. But students who attended a for-profit college account for a tiny share of all students. But 47% of all of the student loan defaults, the federal student loan defaults. They have huge dropout rates, students who are unable to finish because they lack the preparation or receive too little support are left without a degree and with a mountain of debt. The colleges spend more on advertising and recruiting in the aggregate than they do on education, and they focus on low-income students because they are the least able to assess their claims and promises. In fact, the companies together, the Senate found, devote less to actual instructional costs, faculty, and curriculum than to either marketing and recruiting or profit. For every employee teaching or offering support to students, the colleges had 2.5 recruiters bringing in new students. In 2010, the 30 companies employed 35,000 recruiters, more than 1,000 recruiters each, but 80% of the faculty were part-time. The CEOs of the publicly traded for-profit education companies took home on average $7.3 million apiece in compensation. In contrast, the 5 highest paid leaders of large public universities average compensation of about $1 million apiece. So there are real issues that have been brought to the attention of the public. For-profit college enrollments have declined for now because there have been expansions at some traditional universities and in extension programs, but the argument becomes more salient as public higher education is cut back further and further. In California, the public higher education cutbacks left 50,000 students who had met all the requirements, the A through G requirements, and made good grades and passed their tests, being turned away, despite the fact that they met all of the requirements. In many states, corrections costs have outstripped public higher education investments. That is true here, and that's often provoked by a private prison lobby, where we have privatized that sector as well. A much better solution is to protect and expand the public higher education system, and where needed, to encourage nonprofit expansion, and where for-profits are part of the mix, to figure out the right ways to support and regulate the quality of education they must provide so that students are well served in all sectors. Some of these same abuses have been obvious in K-12 for-profit education as well. It is, in fact, hard to make a profit, as Chris Whittle found. You may remember his first promise was that he was going to offer public for-profit education at a price lower than the public schools, and he quickly found he couldn't do it. He couldn't actually provide that, so they changed the mission and became a for-profit management company for schools. And in fact, they did a reasonably responsible job in some places, although their record has been very, very mixed, but they've never really made a profit. Because to do so would require more dramatic cuts in services than they have been willing to undertake. Alternatively, there are for-profit managers in education that have been making a profit. The White Hat Corporation in Ohio comes to mind, where they have done a dismal job of educating students. Some online for-profit companies, in one case, 3/4 of the students didn't even get computers, even though they were signed up. California had to disbar a large charter operation that was a for-profit online charter because they were not providing even the minimal education. I remember in Ohio, my home state, that only 3% of African American males signed up for this large charter company actually managed to graduate. So I think we have some of these same issues. And then there is the rest of the debate about the charter community. And let me say that I have co-founded a charter that operates as a high school in an elementary school district near Stanford, where they didn't have a community public high school. I have worked on the boards of other charters, and I know that there are successful and innovative schools that have been launched as charters, and certainly some that serve students with significant needs without engaging in selective admissions or push-out strategies that have caused concerns about other charters' practices. And yet, national data show that extraordinarily successful charters are something of an anomaly. They're relatively rare. The largest study of charter schools, conducted by researchers at Stanford's Hoover Institution, found that across the 16 states included in the study, charters are about twice as likely to underperform regular public schools serving similar students as they are to outperform such schools. Only 17% of charters exceeded the performance of district-run public schools serving similar students. About 37% did significantly worse. About 46% did about the same. And in a deeper study that we did of charters, we found that the degree to which states regulated the charters had fewer authorizers with more significant oversight authority. To that degree, charters did better than they did in states where there was a wide open market. Y'all come, open up any kind of school you want. And states that had no for-profit charters did better than in states where there were for-profits. Recent federal policies seek to enforce a view that the solution to public school problems is to close failing public schools and replace them with schools that do not have to employ unionized teachers or report to publicly elected school boards. Yet a recent evaluation of Chicago's Renaissance 2010 initiative by the Chicago Consortium for School Research, which replaced a group of schools with new autonomous schools of choice, some of them charters or contract schools, found the achievement of students in the new schools was no different than that of a matched comparison group of students in the old schools they'd left, that both groups continued to be very low performing. So I think this idea that somehow privatization is a panacea or a silver bullet is not, there's not evidence to suggest that that will be true. At the same time, I think it is the case that we do see places where innovations can occur, sometimes more easily in contexts that are different than the traditional public school system than they have sometimes occurred within. So our challenge is going to be, how do we find the way to organize and regulate the sectors that provide educational opportunity without exploiting low-income students in the name of potentially serving them, and preserving, protecting, and investing in our public education system, which in fact is at the core what we need to be sure is operating productively if we are going to have a well-functioning nation. We see what happens when we abandon the investments in public education run publicly, as has happened in New Orleans, where the Southern Poverty Law Center had to bring suit because students with disabilities could not find a charter school that would take them in. In the context of high-stakes accountability, there's a lot of incentive to cream and crop, to take the most easily educable students, to keep out or push out those that are much harder to educate. And that is what we may face if we don't have good public alternatives in whatever system of other alternatives we create. I'll end with one national level warning. Two nations that have most aggressively pursued privatization in their K-12 arenas, Chile and Sweden, both found that those widespread opening up of differential sectors with different admissions and support systems led to wider and wider inequality, to the point where hundreds of thousands of students went on strike in Chile to protest the inequitable provision of education. And Sweden, we used to be one of the highest performing nations in the world, is now substantially lower performing, more on a par with our own country. And Finland, which made its investments in high quality public education, rose to the top of the international rankings. So we need to think about this in a systemic way and be sure that we're addressing the needs of children in poverty and young people who don't have opportunity in ways that are protective rather than potentially exploitive. Thank you.
I agree with Linda that I feel like it's happy hour. I got up at what would be 1 o'clock San Francisco time to catch a 6 o'clock plane out of D.C. to get over here, and I'm ready for a beer every way, shape, or form. I'm obviously from Wisconsin, which Bill told you about, and to tell you why I'm where I am today, I was elected in 1980 to represent western Wisconsin in the Congress of the United States. We had more dairy cows than we had people. I kind of liked that, never got a nasty letter from a dairy cow. And yet, two things happened shortly after I was in office. The family dairy farm was no longer a viable economic entity, and they started going out of business. Generational transfer didn't happen. Some of them didn't succeed. Second thing that happened in my district was that rural manufacturing was the very first manufacturing to leave America, to go south and then to go to the Pacific. I had to deal with the issue of adult learning, career education, lifelong learning as an appropriate definition of my role in 16 years serving western Wisconsin. During that time, I was on the House Education and Labor Committee, as we were called at that point in time, for all 16 years. I was on the Higher Education Subcommittee for all 16 years. And I was known, and I hope I still am known, as an adamant defender of all elements of the post-secondary education delivery system in America. It was actually rather ironic that a year ago, when it was announced that I had been chosen to become the new president of the private sector colleges and universities, or career colleges as some of us know them, I was actually speaking at the National Workforce Conference for the American Association of Community Colleges. And I had a wonderful conversation with one individual there at President Walter Bumphus's reception in his suite. She said, "What are you going to do next?" I said, "Well, it just came out today. I'm going to do this job." She says, "Oh, you're the competition." And I said to her, if we see each other as competition, then everybody loses, in particular the students. And so I may disappoint you in my presentation this evening, because the question that Bill asked us to answer was, is privatization education's answer to poverty? And I would be the first to tell you no. I don't think any sector of higher education by itself is the answer to poverty in this question, in this nation. We need absolutely every element of our post-secondary education system to be engaged and to collaborate. And we need to recognize that in today's era, we need to embrace and celebrate, in response to the diversity of our people and their educational needs, the diversity of a post-secondary education delivery system. And we need to lift up a recognition that in today's era of limited resources, we absolutely need to have a public-private philanthropic partnership if we are going to succeed. I don't think any one of those elements can be eliminated, and I would be the first to tell you the public delivery system ought to be the primary system in the delivery of post-secondary education. Truth is, about 6 years ago, I was one of 2 finalists for president of the University of Wisconsin system. I was the outside candidate. Kevin Riley was the inside candidate. He got chosen. If I'd have got chosen, I wouldn't have had this job, and that I wouldn't have been here defending the private sector per se. You know, whatever. Look at the reality, though, folks. Look at where we are in America today. In March, 11.7 million unemployed, 4.6 million long-term unemployed. In March, 496,000 workers dropped out of the labor force. Unemployment rates in America for our youth today, the national average is 7%, 7.6%. For young white men and women trying to work, it's 22%, 3 times the national average. For young Hispanics trying to work, it's 30%, 4 times. For young African Americans, it's 37%, 5 times the national average. Think of the disservice we as a nation do if we allow those kind of experiences to continue. There's a fascinating article in this week's Economist that talks about the worldwide failure to educate and employ its young people. It's a national and it's an international challenge in front of us. Yet at the same time, by 2020, we know there are going to be 55 million new jobs in this country. 32 million of those are going to be replacement jobs for baby boomers. 23 million of those are going to be brand new jobs that don't even exist today. Of the replacement jobs, 65% require some level of post-secondary education and training. Of the new jobs, 85% require some level of post-secondary education and training. We have a major challenge to educate and prepare the future American workforce for the future American workplace. And I think if there is an evolving consensus in this country today, it is that post-secondary education must consider one of, if not its primary, one of its significant obligations is to prepare people for work. Certainly that's what the American public says today, from the freshman class enrolled in our colleges and universities to their parents in the recent Lumina Gallup survey, etc. So if we have a skills gap, we also have a capacity gap. And there's probably no better place than here in California to talk about the reality of when the public resources are tapped. It is the people perhaps most on the cusp that are left out of that opportunity. Take a look at the two studies last month here in California on the California community college system. One said 591,000, the other said 600,000 students could not get into the community college system in this state because of that particular lack of public resources. On a national level, we know that in the last decade, per capita funding for our four-year public colleges and universities has decreased by 25% nationally. I don't defend that. I don't celebrate that. I'm just simply stating the environment in which we are dealing. And so we look at this question of, in that environment, of both skills needed to be in the workplace and a public sector that's not meeting its responsibility in funding and providing access, who gets hurt the most? Private sector colleges and universities take great pride in the fact that we tend to serve those students who otherwise would not have access to post-secondary education. When you take a look at the demographics of our students, as was indicated earlier, 96% of our students are eligible for federal financial aid. Don't blame our schools for that. That's the reality of the economics of the students trying to get an education. 51% are first-generation college students. 49% have dependents. 46% are of color. During the recent recession, our sector provided 2.3 million students with certificates, credentials, or degrees since the Depression, enabling them to have real skills that apply for real jobs with real incomes and a chance for a real place in America's middle class. During the last decade, we have invested almost $6 billion in private money in building, creating, and equipping career colleges for these students, over $1 billion in the last year alone. What I think we ought to do in this country is we ought to talk about return on investment. And let's just talk about the return on investment in education for associate degrees alone. And I like to focus on that one not only because it's the primary thrust of our education programming, but America today is number 2 in the world on per capita delivery of bachelor's degrees. We're number 16 in the world of per capita associate degrees. And if you believe that not everybody needs a bachelor's degree, but almost everybody needs some level of credential or associate degree, it's those students on the lower economic, social levels of American society that are being left out if we don't respond. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average associate degree will earn just under $500,000 more over their lifetime than that same individual with a high school diploma and no additional education. If it were not for the allied health professions, which you all know are of great service but not great compensation, that return on investment would even be higher when you go into the skilled trades of automotive and HVAC and IT and business and a number of the others. But let's take that 423,000 annual gain. There are 20.6 million Americans with an associate degree today. That means we have $8.7 trillion in additional income by virtue of their achieving an associate degree and using it in the workplace. If you assume even a 15% federal tax rate, you now are looking at $1.3 trillion in additional federal revenues as a return on investment to the federal trough alone because we invested in their education and their opportunity. So we see our sector as an important element, not the exclusive, not the primary, not the only, but an important contributor into creating the education and the skills that gives people who otherwise would not have the chance for upward mobility to have that chance. Thank you.
Okay, let me ask a few questions, and then you guys will ask a few questions or make a few points. So let me begin by talking about outsourcing. We know that outsourcing has become relatively commonplace in the 21st century. The United States has contracted with companies who do work that was once done by the government. Even public schools and universities may outsource custodial services and the like. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of outsourcing public education, which is really what we're talking about?
You want me to go first? The only place, Bill, I would disagree with you is on the concept of outsourcing, because I am one who, for better or for worse, believes that competition is not inherently bad. We celebrate competition within the nonprofit education delivery system. We celebrate, and I think benefit from, education from many different forms of delivery, as I mentioned earlier. But I can tell you that there are two or three things that our sector believes we have contributed to the American higher education conversation today. First of all, we do have to respond to the market. And if we don't respond to the market, the students don't come. And I'll give you a real good example. Our schools, right at the beginning of the recession, made major investments in criminal justice education. They overinvested. They overeducated. And there are students who achieved that degree and have had a difficult time using it and putting it to work. You will see most of our schools, I won't say all, but most of our schools are significantly cutting back on their delivery of criminal justice programs because the market doesn't have a place for the students who are educated. Market responsiveness is absolutely critical. Another place that's really important to us is veterans education. We have 13 to 14% of the total post-secondary enrollment in this country. We have 26% of all veterans attending our school. And we're proud of it. We're proud of it because we have met the veteran where they're at. As Bill told you, I'm a product of the UW-Madison. I benefited and am a big fan of, loyal contributor to, that school. But if you're a veteran, adult, coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, chances are living in a dorm taking 5 3-credit courses at a liberal arts university doesn't meet you where you're at. They want focused academic delivery, often concentrated one course at a time. They want accelerated academic delivery. Most of our schools will produce an associate degree in 18 months. And they want flexible scheduling because almost all of them, while going to school full-time, work part-time as well. So we meet the veteran where they're at, and that's why we have those kind of numbers. But it's not just the market. It's also innovation. For better, for worse, our sector was certainly one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer, in online education. I would suggest to you that our innovation today is not online, it's just not on campus, but it's the development and delivery of the blended model, where we provide some of that basic education online, but we recognize the importance of on-site for mentoring, for collaboration, for laboratory work, and those type of programs. And I think certainly students with multiple barriers to academic success, that blended model is going to be something that will be adopted by every element of higher education in the future as a way of trying to deal with our cost of education at a time that we also look to outcomes. I'll stop there.
So I think the way I'd like to approach that question is the question of what do you want to outsource and what are the effects of outsourcing different things. When does, some things one might outsource, custodial services or, a variety of things one can imagine. There are contexts within which one can imagine that it is less costly, more effective, more efficient to outsource certain kinds of services. But I'm going to go to the K-12 arena. We have to be alert to when outsourcing actually makes the enterprise less accountable, less accessible. The question I would say is when does it serve the public good and when does it not serve the public good to outsource? Let me give you two examples of where I think the notion of outsourcing can go too far, although I would recognize that there are probably many areas in which you could find examples of where it's been effective and productive. The notion of outsourcing almost public schooling almost entirely to entities that are not publicly overseen and do not play by the same rules, do not have the same rules for access and accountability, I think is a real problem. I mentioned New Orleans before. Some people are holding up New Orleans as a big success story. But it is still 67th ranked school district out of 67 in the state of Louisiana. And the only way you can find better graduation rates there is if you include Orleans Parish, which has not been under the Recovery School District, to balance out the data from that district. But you have the situation there kind of in very strong relief of what happens when you have a system where the entities are allowed to admit who they want to admit selectively and keep those who they feel comfortable educating. And we see this in the outcomes for some under-regulated charter school sectors. NCES found that in general the charter sector underserves students with disabilities and underserves relative to regular public school students who are English learners. And if you have the situation within which it is allowable for some parts of a sector that is supposed to serve the public good, which is to educate all children for democratic life in a society, and you have that kind of selectivity operating in large components of the system, then you're no longer then that outsourcing is no longer serving the public good, because at the end of the day, if we see, as we have seen in a number of studies, more push out of young people who have less opportunity to begin with, and greater dropout rates, then the rest of the society is going to suffer because they're going to be on the school-to-prison pipeline. We're going to pay $50,000, as we do in California, for them to be inmates, rather than the $10,000 we might have spent on them in a public school that was well-heeled. So I think we have to look at the question of outsourcing with respect to, are we outsourcing the public requirement for oversight in cases where that preserves and protects access and opportunity that we need for the system to take seriously. Another case, which I think is an interesting one, is the outsourcing of testing in this country. So I've spent a lot of time looking at public education systems in other countries. And in the highest achieving systems, Finland and Singapore, places like Australia and Canada, typically the system itself develops the assessments. They're often open-ended examinations, sometimes oral, increasingly including project-based investigations and components. Teachers score them in a moderated fashion to produce consistency in the scoring. And they come to know the standards deeply, to be able to improve the quality of their curriculum and instruction, and to use them as a force for improving the system as a whole to improve learning, when in fact that function is handled as part of the system rather than outsourced. In this country, we've now outsourced that function to the point where companies send in tests in a brown paper wrapper. Soon it'll be on a computer, but it's still mostly in the brown paper wrapper. It's completely secret. An Australian teacher said to me once, "How do you teach when you don't know what's on the test if it's secret from the teachers, you know, because the teachers create the assessments and score the assessments, and you're trying to develop the capacity to help kids be successful on the assessments." It goes out, it's scored by machine, and then it's used, the scores are used for, as we know, a variety of punitive, increasingly punitive functions. So I think we have to think about this question of outsourcing with respect to when does it serve the capacity of the system to do its job well, and when does it actually begin to undermine the capacity of the system to do the job that it needs to do for the members of the public.
Just some background for myself. The conundrum here to me, since I look at higher education and we're in California, is we need about 100,000 students a year, every year for the next decade to get where we need to go. In 1960, the master plan was created, and when the master plan came about, we were talking about if a citizen wants a higher education, this is where he or she can go. And the master plan dealt with public higher education. Now my guess is if we were creating a master plan today, there would at least be discussion about, is there a private nonprofit participant of a master plan, and is there a private for-profit participant in the master plan? It may not make it into it. But it strikes me that for myself, I'm caught betwixt and between. The public master plan is not able to deal with the capacity issue we face in higher ed. The problem that Linda's talking about, we've seen in spades in terms of California, which is the problem of regulation. The regulation of the for-profit higher ed industry in California is not in education, it's in the Consumer Affairs Office, and there are two folks in that Consumer Affairs Office. I mean, imagine trying to, it doesn't. So let me ask about innovation and regulation, because they often seem to be two sides of a debate. Many assume the private sector can do a better job at innovation. And others of us believe that the government's role is effective regulation. But those who are innovators frequently deride governmental regulation, red tape, etc. And those who want to regulate frequently condemn efforts to let the market reign supreme. So how do we resolve this?
You go first, Steve.
That's how we resolve it.
I spent 22 years in elected office in the Wisconsin State Legislature and the U.S. Congress. We never solved that issue in terms of achieving the right balance. I always told people when they said to me, when are we going to get more regulation than we already have? I said, as soon as you see the fraud in the headlines of the local paper, the Congress or the state legislature will respond with additional regulations the next day or the next week or the next month. And so everybody wants us to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, but everybody also wants us to eliminate regulations, paperwork, and all of that. You can't do both. So the question is, how do we find that healthy balance? And I think what everyone will tell you is that that balance is a pendulum. It goes back and forth. And many of you may be aware that the Secretary announced a couple weeks ago that they were going to do a series of 4 hearings, and then they were going to begin a whole series of negotiated rulemaking on many elements of the Higher Education Act. I don't know how Congress feels about the department sort of kidnapping the entire process of reauthorization by themselves, and I'll let Congress deal with that issue per se. But I do think that 2 things are going to come out of that process, if I'm predicting accurately. The first of those is that you will see not my sector, but you'll see the American Council on Education, and you will see all of higher education really lift up in pretty strong terms what they think has been the dramatic increase in regulations on higher education over the last 4 years. The other thing that I think will happen is that we will see an effort to focus on outcomes. And that effort to focus on outcomes will be universal across all elements of higher ed, not just my sector, but all elements of higher ed. And it gets to one of those issues that Linda was talking about earlier, because there is a moral question here. It's not even a public policy question. It's the moral question of how much risk are we as a nation willing to take to give those who have had less opportunity a chance to succeed. And you know, she was talking about charter schools limiting enrollment and all of that. And as I listened to Linda, and I don't disagree with anything she said, I couldn't help but reflect about the fact that my schools for the last 4 to 5 years really practiced open enrollment, open access. We brought them in with the belief, and frankly, under national accreditation, we had to have averages of 70% completion, graduation, placement, etc. So we had a standard there. But what's happened to our sector in the last couple of years, with the criticisms from Senator Harkin, Senator Durbin, some in the press, etc., we've responded exactly as you'd expect us to do. We've limited access. We have stopped taking those students most at risk because we want to focus on retention, graduation, completion, and placement. Now, at the end of this conversation, when this is fully implemented, and I can tell you one set of schools in the Midwest that told me they have turned away over 5,000 students in this one family-owned set of schools in the last year. We will look good. The moral question is what happened to those students who were not allowed to even pursue a career-based education and training program?
I think the answer to that question is in part going to be whether we make the public investments in community colleges and restoring them to the role that they traditionally have had. I mean, that's part of the answer to that question. But I think it's a great question, the question about regulation and innovation. And it's interesting. I don't think that, although it is part of the rhetoric, I don't think it's actually true that the private sector necessarily innovates more than the public sector. But I do think that regulators can make it harder for both sectors to innovate, depending on how they regulate. And I think about two things when I think about innovation. A lot of the most innovative school models that are now used across the country and often adapted by high-quality charter schools were those created by public schools in New York City. Under a chancellor, and some of you remember this, when Joe Fernandez sort of threw down and said, I'm going to accept proposals from communities and teachers and others for new models of schools. And we're going to enable those, and we're going to resource them, and so on. And innovation was widespread, high-quality innovation because it was carefully regulated. There was access was regulated so that you could be sure that kids could, from different ability and achievement levels, could get into schools and so on. And amazing school designs were created. That was in the public sector. And you see some of that, of course, in the private or the charter sector, which is kind of a blend of public and private, but not necessarily in greater quantity. But the question is whether we have people who hyper-regulate the process of teaching and learning, and I think you can close down regulation and innovation in any sector by doing that. What do we need to regulate? We need to regulate equitable resources, and I'm now talking about the public sector. You need to be sure that there's a level playing field. You need to regulate the protection of access and kind of protect civil and constitutional rights in that process. I think you need to regulate in the K-12 sector the assurance of competence on the part of professionals, because if you do those three things, that is, if you make sure those are happening, you can then deregulate the way in which people do their work. But if you don't do those, you're going to, as we've seen in some places, hyper-regulate the way in which people do their work. Try to prescribe the curriculum, you try to prescribe the processes. And this is the bargain that all professions make with the public, that we will regulate the quality of knowledge and skills that people possess when they come in, and their responsiveness and responsibility, their ethical commitment, and then deregulate or not regulate the way in which they try to do their work. I think it's one of the reasons, frankly, that higher education has been successful in the United States, that we have had mostly that kind of a bargain. And that bargain was in its best shape in the 60s and 70s when we had intensive financial aid making higher education accessible. We had a pretty high assurance of competence, and we tried to create more equitable access to resources across sectors. So I think that there's, again, a place to find license to innovate with the right kind of regulation that protects the public good, but doesn't try to hyper-regulate the processes of education.
Let me ask one other question, then we'll open it up to you guys. And let's jump forward to 2025, my favorite year.
I'm sorry, what year was that?
2025. If you had a crystal ball and we look into the future, what's your expectation about the state of privatization in education?
I think it's your turn to go first.
There is some kind of a fairness principle there that I have to acknowledge. I find privatization in this context, we've problematized or complexified this idea of privatization in a discussion, so it's a hard question to answer. But let me sort of take what I have painted perhaps as the worst types of privatization, that is privatization that forgets the public good, that is operating in a way that is for the benefit of individuals who are not taking care of our needs for high quality education for all with high levels of access, et cetera. And I think that brand of privatization, which many people are concerned about, including myself, will, whether that is predominant in 2025 will in part depend on whether we've had campaign finance reform by then. Because one of the things that's driving a lot of decision making is the ability of individuals looking for profits in healthcare and education and all sectors of American life to basically buy what they want from the Congress, rather than to make policy that is in the public good. And whatever the balance is of provision of education across sectors, the extent to which it serves the public good rather than private interests that may be antithetical in some instances to the public good is going to depend on whether we have legislators who are operating for the public good rather than being bought in what is now the widespread development of policy around money.
I want to disappoint Bill and probably surprise some of you that we agree, not only on campaign finance reform, but also on redistricting nationally. If I were a person of wealth and I had a foundation, I would put all of my money into redistricting reform, because I can tell you that if we continue to have congressional or state legislative districts that are safe one-party districts, you will have the far left and the far right in your legislative bodies, and they will never agree on anything or work together on anything, and any reforms will be accidental, and they will probably be outside of the public sector, and I don't think that's healthy. So I think we've got both sides of election reform that are very important there. That being said, 2025, I think, will see a significant graying of the black and white boundaries between public post-secondary education and public-private post-secondary education. I can't speak, I'm not an expert on K-12, and I don't want to pretend I am just because I got a mic, but so I'll drop that one. But we are already beginning to see significant examples of collaboration between traditional colleges and universities and career colleges. Various states, land-grant universities are partnering with some of our schools where they will provide some of those basic liberal arts science kind of courses, and our schools will provide more of the career focus and training, etc. I think you will continue to see that type of graying of the divisions between us. I also think that politically, the Congress and obviously the administration are going to continue to push for some kind of reforms in the accreditation process. And I think you will find, as you already are seeing, more of my schools are being regionally accredited. And I think as we see the development of more, should I say, career specialized schools, even within the public sector, I think there's going to be some real graying of those lines. The third thing I think is going to happen is I really believe post-secondary education is going to go global. And I don't know what that means in terms of regulation, but I do know that it is going to minimize the boundaries between the public and the private sectors.
Okay. I'd like 3 terrific questions. This is being live streamed, so if you could speak in the microphone, just get up and do it. And there's 3 right there, so go for it.
They're all being too kind.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your comments. My name is Constance Elo, and I'm a doctoral student at
Can we
the
get the
University.
mic on?
Okay.
It's on. I just
Can you hear me now?
can't
Yeah.
Okay,
There.
great.
Just needed to be taller.
Okay, great. My name is Constance Elo. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Southern California. And so I'm really curious about, in this new era and market for higher education, how we understand what for-profit higher education really is. And my question is not to come off as simple. We see that a number of different institutions are making strategic moves that seem, revenue-focused in nature. And so you spoke a little bit about these blurring lines, but I'm really interested in how we understand how institutions are becoming more innovative, revenue-focused, and moving past the legal definitions that we see as for-profit higher education, and how that might impact the implications and policy we have for higher education.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And let me just do starters, and I'll pick on both of our houses. I'll guarantee you the Stanford and the University of Wisconsin athletic departments make big money. I will also guarantee you the schools of business on both campuses make money. So what's the question of who makes money and what isn't, and how do you define what that is? On the other side of the equation, if you understand the history of the evolvement of the for-profit sector in American post-secondary education, it started with trade schools, it started with family-owned business schools, healthcare schools, etc., and it evolved into what we have today with the publicly traded, etc. I point out to people, just because you're organized as a for-profit doesn't mean you make money. Any more than General Motors made money in the last 4 years. I mean, let's recognize that, and it gets to where Bergeron, in his recent interview upon leaving the Department of Education, said, we ought to quit focusing on the corporate structure, and we ought to focus exclusively on student outcomes. And I happen to agree with him.
Linda, do you?
Well, I think that it is appropriate to look at some aspects of student outcomes, and I think that the scrutiny that has caused, some attention to the for-profit as well as other higher education sector has some utility. But I think we also have to focus on the students' opportunities to learn in those contexts. And it worries me when 80% of the faculty are part-time, when there are more recruiters than there are teachers, when the opportunity to learn, when the way to address the concern is to perhaps admit fewer of the high-need students, but may not always be to improve the quality of the opportunities that they get. Now, I think that there has been improvement in the opportunities to learn in all of these sectors. But I think that's what we ought to be going for. We ought to be concerned about the opportunity to learn as well as the outcomes that students encounter in whatever the education institution is. That's what accreditation is supposed to do. Let's hope that we can create a world in which it does that job well.
I'm Tracy Williams from Seattle Pacific University. I am running a campaign, Linda Darling-Hammond, for EdSec. But I have a serious question, because the state of Washington holds the education of our children as a paramount duty in our Constitution. Our Supreme Court has asked our legislature to fully fund basic education. Our legislature cannot figure out how to do this. We've tried to figure out who to hold accountable for this. In our complex world of accountability, we can't do this in the state of Washington. But our public managed to pass one of the most ridiculous charter laws in the nation. It is currently being held up by trying to figure out how to make sense of this. But what's your advice? How should thoughtful policymakers and educators in our state put pressure to balance this out and keep education funds heading for all children in our state?
I'm going to quote her. Really, I think that the side that puts the focus on students will win the political debate. The side that puts the focus on children will win the political debate. And, you know, I've seen public-private debates at both the state level and the federal level. And I will tell you that when the focus was on the students, not the systems, that side won the political outcome.
I will just add a thought, which is that I think that is good advice, but it doesn't always work. And we have gotten used to inadequacy and inequality in our public education systems, which is one of the reasons that we have all of this Sturm und Drang going on. Right now in the country, there are about 44 states that have, within the last few years, had a school finance lawsuit. And that means almost every state has its state bird, its state flag, and its state school finance lawsuit. And I think sometimes because this is hard to do politically, even if you focus on children, litigation is important. And I think we're also going to have to be pushing again, as some are looking to do, toward the designation of a federal right to education that allows us some protection in the erosion of resources going to public schools. Now, we do have cases where that litigation has paid off, and I think maybe that's going to have to be part of the process in Washington to prevent the slide of funding for the public schools. And by the way, Jerry Brown, when he's finished being governor here for 2 terms, might come up to Washington if you... He's thrown down for his weighted student formula and stronger investments on a more equitable basis in California. I think we might actually get that here. And I think that we're going to begin to see a return to a focus on the preservation of our public school systems. But we do have to advocate. We do have to, as Steve said, advocate on behalf of the students. And then we have to litigate when we can't otherwise get our needs met. Tracy.
So this is a question for Dr. Darling-Hammond specifically, but also feel free to chime in. Okay, so question is in terms of K-12, and there's a lot of foundations entering the education reform space. So large companies have a foundation wing, and they have funds invested in education reform, especially around charter schools. So if you could speak a little bit to the pros and cons of these foundations being involved. Is there an undercurrent of a hidden agenda there? As folks speculate, it may not be clear now, but is there possibly something there? And then also, being in higher education, and many of us function on grants, and say we obtain grants from a foundation around education reform, and we know they have a particular bend. And balancing, being objective as higher education and sort of engaging in research-based approaches with, the inherent sort of wink, I shouldn't say that, the inherent interest of these funders that are not necessarily federal, and they have their own perspectives and takes on education reform. So sort of a two-part question.
That's a really big one.
Okay.
Well, I think, we have the same issues and parameters that we need to be discussing with respect to philanthropy, that we discuss with respect to the public and the private sectors, which is how do we ensure that what people are doing is motivated by what's in the public good. And, that is, I think, on the table everywhere these days. Then there are cases, obviously, and it's one of the reasons I am so leery, particularly of the for-profit sector, where philanthropy is building charter chains that are intended to make profits for some of the companies that are involved in the philanthropy. So that's, clearly there are some conflicts of interest that are possible and are in fact happening. Another place where you see some of this conflict of interest is in the area of things like building data systems and testing systems. New York was a particularly amazing case in point where as Chancellor of the New York City Schools, Joel Klein, called for the creation of a data system that would be used to assemble test scores that could be used to evaluate teachers. He left the chancellorship, was employed by Murdoch and Bloomberg in the wireless generation, and immediately was granted a contract that he kind of tossed the contract in the air with one hand, left the system and ran to the other side and caught the contract to build the data system that was required by the policies he had just enacted. It was later voided by the state of New York when the conflict of interest was raised. But I think there are these questions about to what extent are we enacting policies that are going to serve the public good, and to what extent are we enacting policies or being encouraged to enact policies that do have private interests more primarily at the forefront. So it's an interesting question. I think none of these things have simple answers, and there's not a single brush that you can use to paint all of the policies or the enterprises that are engaged in them, but we do have to continue to ask the question. I think this is a moment where the key question we should be asking about all of the ways in which we're innovating, and some of them will prove to be productive for us, that involve new forms of governance, that involve new forms of organization of education, but we should always ask the question, how does it serve the public good? And where it doesn't, what would we need to do to ensure that the public good is going to be served?
I'll be very quick. I had the privilege serving 6 years as president and CEO of the Council on Foundations, and during that time I would often answer questions like yours by saying, understand the difference between charity and philanthropy. Charity is an instantaneous gift to the heart. We give it, we're proud to give it, we have no accountability. We don't expect accountability in outcomes. It's a gift to the heart. Philanthropy is a strategic investment in long-term social change. If it's not long-term and it's not strategic, it's not good philanthropy. Now, having said that, in America, we have philanthropy on the ideological right and on the ideological left. And I would go back to something Secretary Duncan said at the previous plenary, where he said we often benefit from those conversations on both sides if we can find a way to lift up the best of both in the middle. I'm a huge fan of community foundations because I think the community foundation defines social good, public good, strategic philanthropy in a way that tends to be more ideological neutral than other forms of philanthropy. And so I really push that as a way to bring philanthropy to the table in our communities.
Okay, do we have one last fabulous question? And then I'll let us go. Okay, go for it.
I don't know if it's fabulous.
I hope
but
it's fabulous.
It is quick.
That's good too.
Yeah. Hi, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Washington Early Childhood Development and Education Program. And I have one very good question. The U.S. Secretary of Education just talked about preschool for all. So I was wondering how you think that can be accomplished, either with the help of the private industry or public education system. Very quick. Thank you.
It's preschool for all.
Oh. She's the expert, but that doesn't mean I don't have an opinion. It's the last question, so I can stop right now. And to blow some of your minds, Bill talked about the book I just published, The New Middle Class. In there I talk about pre-K 14. I'm that committed to preparing people for the world of work and the world in which we're entering. Universal pre-K 14. I also talk about how we can fund it as not just through taxes, philanthropy, et cetera. I talk about that. But when we talk about pre-K, I wish we would be advocates for universal pre-K, and we wouldn't get hung up on just one delivery system, because I think we could get there a lot sooner. And in a lot of our communities, I will tell you that the nonprofit and even the religious-based pre-K is as good as any pre-K in that community.
So I also want to speak to universal pre-K as an important way to think about this. There is the big debate about targeted preschool, but that often means that you're going to build segregated settings in which income segregation is as pronounced as other forms of racial, ethnic, and other segregation. There is a strong argument for the fact that you get the returns to preschool are so large to a community that it pays for itself eventually, and perhaps sooner than some people would think. But you do have to make those investments, and a lot of those investments are going to need to be in new public sector early childhood programs. We have states that have really pursued that in a high-quality way. New Jersey, Oklahoma, and some others. I think there are models of how you can produce that, but it is going to be a mixed sector. We have a very diverse sector in early learning now, as you said, religious and private, as well as public entities. And I think we do have to include all parts of the sector. And here's a place where I may surprise you. One of the things I experienced early on, because I did start a private preschool and daycare center years ago when my kids needed one, and there were latchkey kids in an elementary school that needed after-school care and so on. Maryland at that time had a voucher system essentially for early childhood, which meant that based on a sliding scale, you could get a voucher to take to whatever setting you could locate for early childhood. And it worked actually very well, along with strong public investments and strong public settings that came later. But at that time, there was very little public investment in early learning. But it worked to allow people to create settings which were well regulated, by the way, around the quality of the opportunity to learn they provided, the ratios of adults to children, the training of the adults, so that there was protection in that system. But it worked to produce the settings in which you could have high-quality early learning in economically integrated settings in which everyone was able to afford the opportunities. So that's a place where I think, in the right way, fostering innovation with the right kinds of regulation, with the right kinds of funding mechanisms, we could get to universal preschool much more quickly than many would otherwise think we could, and I think it's something we've got to pursue with great vigor, with stronger public investments than we were able to have in the past.
Okay, let's thank our speakers.